Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss Labour's latest housing policy announcement as they plan to allow councils to buy up land for development cheaply. But what I'd particularly like to discuss is how mad the situation is whereby the Conservatives, a party suffering because of a lack of homeowners in the UK, did not pursue this policy themselves, and how, ironically, it could give them a lifeline. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So last year, Rishi Sunak broke another manifesto promise by U-turning on the legislation that was going to force house building targets on local councils. He backed down as a result of a rebellion, which had its roots in Conservative councils not wanting to have significant developments in their areas. The main reason why house building has been stifled under the Conservatives, going right back to Cameron and Osborne, is because of Tory NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. Our voters don't like new developments, Osborne famously said, because they already own their own homes. A typically short-sighted Tory attitude. What happens, though, when you prevent an entire generation from being able to get onto the housing ladder, at least in significant numbers? You know, as those home-owning voters become a smaller and smaller proportion of the voting public, what happens to the Tories then? Well, we've seen what happens. I've talked about this several times before, but most recently on Labour Social this morning, because it's now been reported in the Times. Millennials are actually getting more left-wing as they get older, where previous generations have turned more right-wing. And that's always been the case. You know, this is a massive problem for the Conservatives. It's largely of their own making. Because take housing, because this is a huge part of the problem. So you get a mortgage in your 20s, you will struggle for the first few years to live within your means, but you get through. 10 years later, you are earning more money, but your mortgage payments are about the same. Admittedly, the latest interest rate hikes have made a mess of that, but that's also the Tories' fault. But in general, your mortgage payments are now a much smaller proportion of your income, 10 years later, 15 years later especially. And so you have more money to afford that better standard of living, better food, holidays, new car, nice telly, savings starting to accrue, you know, whatever floats your boat. But life starts to get more comfortable. But what about those who can't get on to the housing ladder, who can't get a mortgage? Either they couldn't save up the deposit because incomes have been kept below the level of inflation and rents just keep going up above it, or just because house prices as a ratio of incomes has grown too much. Well, 10 years down the line, their rent payments have been increasing at or above the level of inflation in most cases. Sometimes people get a little bit lucky. So renters are not getting that extra disposable income to improve their standard of living. You know, a 40-year-old now, after 13 years of a Tory government, may have a lower standard of living compared to when they were 25, having spent their entire adult life up until that point under a Labour government. Of course, millennials are not turning Conservatives as they get older. Of course they're not. Why would they? What is their incentive to do so when Conservative policies are not even pretending to improve their lives? So then you see this latest policy announcement from Labour's Lisa Nandy. After Keir Starmer had already made it clear that Labour would impose the house building targets that Sunak was too afraid to, Nandy says that Labour would really go to town on the compulsory purchase orders. Housing is such a crisis now that Labour have announced plans to get things moving quickly as soon as they form a government. Nandy talked about legislation allowing local authorities to buy up land if they want it for development, and they will be able to do so at well below the market value as well. It was actually quite funny when I read one article on the matter saying that Starmer is clearly willing to risk the ire of landowners to pursue this policy. Like Labour should ever give a shit about what landowners think. The party needs to be pro-business but not pro-greed. And there'll be a lot of councils making use of these new laws. Conservative councils, okay, they may need a little bit of cajoling with housing targets because remember, they are the ones who put the kibosh on the Conservatives' plans to introduce these targets. Because that's what's happened. I say going back to Cameron and Osborne, and they were the ones who stifled house building, and it's actually shot themselves in the foot. The reason why under Boris Johnson, they announced a manifesto promise to introduce these targets, is they realise that. They now realise that what's happening is they're losing voters. The homeowners, tend to be middle-aged to older, but as the older ones get really old and then die, they're not being replaced by the millennial generation, and certainly not going to be replaced by Generation Z, because they're even a worse situation. And it's a little bit iffy about my own generation, Generation X. And, they've realised that actually, our voters tends to be homeowners. We rely on homeowners. We stopped building houses, so now we haven't got as many homeowners. Oh my goodness, this is a problem. So they introduced the targets. But then they've gone back on them because they're in that weird situation where they know they're storing up trouble for the future, because if they have whole generations that very few of them are homeowners, then that's very few of them being Conservative voters. But at the same time, they still rely on a core of homeowners to vote for them in the next election. It's all a mess. But, every now and then I see a story in the media about a council. It's never a Conservative council, of course. A council complaining that central government is making it difficult to impossible to build houses. They want to do it. So whatever happens during the next period of Labour government, it's clear that stagnation in house building is not going to be one of them. In fact, you would think the only hurdles that the government's going to have to overcome here, and councils, is being able to source the materials and the builders to carry out the actual work. But then I got to thinking, as I say, of going back to this idea of the Conservatives losing the millennial generation, and of course the Generation Z, forget about it at the moment. And there's really strong evidence that these younger generations are just not turning Conservatives as they get older in the UK or the USA, as it happens. And in the UK, millennials, who are now getting towards the ages where they start to vote in large numbers, are becoming more left-wing as they get older. It's really weird. The US graph shows that that millennials were getting more right-wing and then suddenly became more left-wing. Whereas in this country, there's just more left-wing as you go through. And someone made a good point, I think, that it's possibly due to the difference between the governments in America and Britain in terms of, we, for example, have had the Conservatives in power for 13 years. In America, they haven't done. That's more recent. Obviously, it's not at the moment, but under Trump. So in this country, it's been steady. So millennials have just gone, they were getting to their late 20s, getting to the point where maybe they'd or mid to late 20s, want to get onto the housing ladder. The older ones, that is. The younger ones were still at school. And all of a sudden, banking crisis. Well, I mean, that was that for a few years in terms of getting a mortgage easily. But it never recovered. The Tories were in power then, and it never recovered. And it just gets you to thinking. So, because one of the major reasons for these millennials not turning Conservative as they get older is not being able to get onto the housing ladder. Not being able to, 10, 15 years down the line, have the more disposable income, be able to afford the standard of living, and think to themselves, the Conservatives say they could give us all of this for no extra cost. In fact, they reduce our taxes. Oh, that sounds marvellous, absolutely marvellous. And you think to yourself, so the Conservatives have shot themselves in the foot. There's people right now rubbing their hands with glee, thinking that in the next 20, maybe 30 years, that the Conservatives will be just gone. And I've tended to argue, well, probably not, because, there's going to be lots of money behind them all the time. But if they can't attract the voters, it's going to be trouble, isn't it? It's going to be trouble. So what do they do? It might be that Labour do them a solid by their housing policies, because Starmer has specifically said as well, he hopes that these policies actually lower housing prices. Now, obviously, property owners aren't going to be liking that one, but that's what he said. He actively hopes, not just stops them rising and rising and rising above the level of people's incomes, but actively reduces them. He wants people to be able to own their own homes. Now, there are different attitudes in terms of housing policy. Labour's policy is, look, we want home ownership. We want everyone to be able to own their own home. Other people will say, well, no, I would prefer it if the states just owned the homes so that they were there available for cheap rents for people who can't get on the housing ladder. My personal preference is that the state do control housing. They build houses and everyone gets access to one. But you can also, but through a home ownership scheme, but instead of going for a private mortgage with a bank, the government basically gives you the house and you pay it back, share of your income, in much the same way student loans work. But no one will ever go ahead with that. So I don't actually care between home ownership and council housing. Because the way I see it, when the Conservatives come back, does it matter? It makes no difference. In fact, actually, the home ownership is more resilient to the Conservatives coming back. Because what happens when the Conservatives come into power and there's a load of council houses? We know what happens. It's not speculation. We saw it happen, didn't we, when I was a young lad? We know what happens. The Conservatives sell them off cheap. So actually, Labour, I think, of the two policies, more council houses or building houses so that people can get onto the housing ladder, which is the better one? Probably letting people get onto the housing ladder, because we know what happens to council houses when the Conservatives come into power. And in terms of this idea of the Conservatives, you know, strangling off their source of voters in the future, doesn't matter how you expand housing, if people start to feel that they're now comfortable and they're not paying excessive rents, that they're able to get themselves somewhere, whether it's paying a cheaper rent or getting themselves on the housing ladder so their mortgage payments stay the same 10, 15 years down the line, these younger generations might then be able to go, oh, you know, life's getting better as we get into our middle age, we can afford some more things. And all of a sudden, that Tory appeal of, well, we can give you the same thing, but lower taxes. And it starts to appeal again. And you just think to yourself, this housing, and it's the right thing to do, this housing, obviously I'm not suggesting Labour stifle housing as well, but you just look at it and you think, this is probably going to give the Conservatives a lifeline in 20, 30 years, isn't it? This is actually going to help them out. And then what will happen is the Conservatives, as they always do, they come in, asset strip the country, leave it in a terrible state. People vote Labour in because it's all a terrible nightmare. Labour build it all back up. Then people get complacent. They listen to the, oh yeah, from the Tories, we could offer you all of this and at lower taxes because Labour are just too spendthrift, really. And then they, oh, that's nice. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll have the lower taxes and everything else. We're having everything else as well. Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh, yeah, we'll do that then. They vote them in, and then the whole hideous cycle begins again. And you just think, you know, this... It's grim looking at it. It's grim looking at it. It's the right thing to do to make sure that there's enough housing for everyone. And yet you think, this will actually, ironically, help the Tories out at the time where otherwise they might be sinking into the abyss. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.